The entire trajectory of my life shifted in less than 3 hours, transforming me from a broken stranger into a legal husband. Making such an impulsive, irrational, and completely reckless decision on a whim should have been a recipe for absolute disaster. Yet, looking back at 47 years of existence, it stands as the absolute best decision I have ever made. To truly understand why I bound my life to a woman I had just met, you have to understand the quiet, draining hell I had been surviving before that cold December afternoon. My name is Arthur, and for over a decade, I have quietly worked as a supervisor at a local manufacturing plant. It is a modest living that keeps a roof over my head, pays the utility bills, and buys groceries, but nothing more. I have never been the kind of man who commands attention or stands out in a crowded room. I am just an ordinary guy with graying hair who had long accepted being invisible. After a brutal divorce 15 years ago stripped away my finances and my self-esteem, I learned to embrace that solitude, expecting absolutely nothing from the world until Clara walked into my life. Clara was a vibrant, magnetic force of nature who seemed to draw every eye and light up any room she entered. When she suddenly showed interest in me during a casual neighborhood gathering 2 years ago, I felt an overwhelming sense of disbelief and wonder. She laughed warmly at my awkward jokes, leaned in close when we spoke, and made me feel like I was the only person who mattered in her crowded world. At 45, when I believed my chances at love were completely gone, Clara felt like a beautiful miracle sent to rescue me from my isolation. In a surprising turn of events, she was the one who proposed to me just 6 months into our relationship, catching me completely off guard over dinner. She took my hands, looked into my eyes, and declared that she wanted to make our commitment official and build a lasting future together. Overwhelmed with joy, I readily agreed, and we eagerly set our wedding date for the upcoming spring. For the next half year, I scraped together every spare penny for the rings, skipping meals and walking miles in the cold to save money, happy to sacrifice everything for her. When our wedding day finally arrived in early spring, I stood inside the municipal clerk office at exactly 2 in the afternoon. I wore my one decent dark suit, polished my dress shoes until they gleamed, and kept nervously touching the gold bands resting in my pocket. I had every required document neatly organized in a folder, ready for the moment we would officially become husband and wife. But as the clock ticked away, the scheduled hour came and went, and Clara was nowhere to be found. After 2 agonizing hours of pacing the lobby and staring at my silent phone, Clara finally called me, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. She claimed her mother had suffered a sudden, terrifying medical emergency and that she had been forced to rush straight to the hospital. Naturally, I swallowed my disappointment and forgave her immediately, because only a monster would demand a wedding during a family crisis. We quietly rescheduled the ceremony for the summer, and I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. When the summer date arrived, I found myself back in the exact same waiting room, wearing the same suit and holding those same unused rings. Clara had repeatedly promised me that absolutely nothing would get in our way this time, yet the familiar anxiety began to creep back in. I watched other couples arrive hand in hand, sign their marriage certificates, and leave smiling, while I sat entirely alone on the hard plastic chairs. At 4 o'clock, a brief text arrived claiming a massive crisis at her sales job demanded her attention, and she never showed up. By the time our third attempt rolled around in autumn, the front desk clerk, an older woman named Beatrice with a stern but kind demeanor, recognized my face. Instead of the usual polite indifference she showed to strangers, she looked at me with a heavy, crushing pity that made my cheeks burn with shame. Clara had sworn on everything she held sacred that she was already on her way, yet the hours slipped past once more. Her excuse this time was a sudden car breakdown on the interstate with a dead phone battery, a story I quietly accepted because I was too terrified to face the truth. Now it was a freezing afternoon in December, marking my 4th time standing in this bleak, depressing building that had beginning to feel like a sentencing court. I had been waiting for over an hour, clutching the same gold rings that had lived in my pocket for 9 months without ever seeing the light of day. I sent 5 increasingly desperate messages to Clara, watching the status update to read, yet receiving absolutely nothing but silence in return. Those cold blue check marks on my screen hurt worse than any elaborate lie she could have possibly fabricated. As I sat there sinking into absolute despair, I noticed a woman sitting in the far corner of the room, dressed in an elegant cream-colored suit. She was crying silently, desperately clutching a damp handkerchief as she tried to maintain her composure in front of the small crowd. There was something profoundly familiar about the quiet humiliation in her posture, a silent agony of someone who had just realized they were utterly discarded. I recognized that specific pain instantly, because it was the exact same heavy darkness wrapping around my own chest. Beatrice slowly walked away from her desk, her reading glasses dangling from a silver chain as she approached my chair with a heavy sigh. She called me by my name, her voice carrying a gentle but firm tone that made me realize she was about to shatter my fragile illusions. She told me flatly that Clara was not coming, pointing out that this was the 4th time I had showed up with my hopes only to be left abandoned. She gently insisted that while one cancellation is bad luck, 4 times is a calculated act of cruelty. Her words cut deep because I knew she was entirely correct, forcing me to finally confront the reality I had been desperately trying to ignore. Beatrice passionately argued that someone who truly cared about me would never subject me to this public degradation over and over again. I felt a quiet snap inside my chest, a sudden breaking of the heavy chain of denial that had kept me bound to Clara for so long. When I softly asked what I was supposed to do next, Beatrice glanced toward the crying woman in the corner. She explained that the woman was named Diana, and just like me, her partner had failed to show up for their scheduled wedding that afternoon. Beatrice looked back and forth between us, a wild, unconventional spark lighting up her tired eyes as she weighed a truly insane suggestion. She pointed out that we both had our legal documents, our witnesses, and our broken hearts, so we might as well just marry each other. I froze in absolute shock, wondering if the clerk had completely lost her mind after decades of watching broken relationships. When I stammered that marrying a complete stranger was entirely crazy, Beatrice countered that it was far less crazy than waiting for someone who repeatedly lied to me. She challenged me to ask myself what else I possibly had to lose, since my dignity and time had already been stolen from me. Her twisted, desperate logic began to take root in my mind as I stared at the floor, realizing I could not face going back to my empty apartment alone. Driven by a sudden surge of reckless determination, I stood up and walked toward Diana. My legs shook with every step, my heart hammering against my ribs as I stopped a few feet away from where she sat weeping. Diana looked up in surprise, her eyes red and her makeup ruined, looking at me with a mixture of caution and exhaustion. I cleared my throat, apologized for the intrusion, and quickly explained that the clerk had told me we were both facing the exact same humiliation. I told her about Clara, the 4 cancelled weddings, and the shared pain that had brought us to this moment. The caution in Diana's eyes slowly softened into a quiet understanding as she listened to my ridiculous, desperate story. When she asked what I wanted, I took a deep breath and delivered the insane proposal, suggesting we bypass our absent partners and get married right now. Diana stared at me as if I had lost my mind, her jaw dropping in disbelief before she flatly called me completely crazy. I quickly agreed with her assessment, but urged her to think about the practical reality of our shared disaster. Diana listened quietly as I explained that we both had important, urgent reasons for needing a marriage certificate today, and that we had both been betrayed. She revealed that she had recently resigned from her accounting career in another state to relocate for her partner, only for him to completely vanish today. He had turned off his phone and left her stranded in a new city where she had no job, no family, and no security. Her landlord required a marriage lease guarantee, meaning his abandonment threatened to leave her completely homeless. Hearing her story sparked a sudden wave of protective anger inside me, making me realize that our meeting was a bizarre twist of fate. I sat down in the chair beside her, and we began reviewing our official identification cards and verifying each other's backgrounds on our phones. We called my landlord and her previous employer, quickly confirming that neither of us was a dangerous criminal or a liar. With only 30 minutes left before the clerk office closed, we made a sudden silent pact to take back control of our lives. We established 5 strict, practical rules to govern our unconventional arrangement, agreeing to live separate lives with absolutely no romantic expectations. We promised total financial independence, mutual respect, and a commitment to reevaluate our situation in 6 months to see if a quiet divorce was necessary. I pulled the unused gold bands from my pocket, offering them as a practical tool for our contract rather than a symbol of romance. Diana took one of the rings, turning it over in her hand, before she softly agreed to the plan. Beatrice quickly gathered 2 office employees to serve as our legal witnesses, moving us into the small ceremony room with efficient speed. Within 15 minutes, under the bright fluorescent lights of the municipal office, Diana and I stood side by side and officially exchanged our vows. There were no flowers, no cheering family members, and no romantic music, yet sliding the gold ring onto her finger felt incredibly significant. As we walked out onto the sunny street as husband and wife, we both felt a strange, dizzying sense of liberation. We walked to a quiet diner nearby to share a celebratory meal of simple comfort food, both of us starving after the day's intense emotional exhaustion. As we ate, our phones began vibrating with desperate messages from our exes, both of them offering pathetic, transparent excuses for their absence. We quietly took photos of our official marriage certificate, sent them to Clara and Francisco with brief parting messages, and blocked their numbers forever. In that shared moment of defiance, we looked at each other and shared our first genuine laughing smile. Over the next 2 months, our structured arrangement slowly evolved into a warm, comfortable partnership that neither of us wanted to disrupt. I began driving Diana to her new accounting job every morning, and our quiet commutes quickly became the absolute best part of my daily routine. We talked about our lives, our dreams, and our past heartbreaks, finding a rare, healing comfort in each other's constant presence. I realized with a jolt of panic that the strict rules we had created were beginning to dissolve into real feelings. Our connection was put to the test in February when we ran into Clara and her wealthy employer at a local grocery store. Clara immediately noticed our matching wedding rings and began shouting insults, calling me boring, predictable, and entirely disposable. Diana stepped forward with a calm, fierce intensity, defending my character and exposing Clara's cruelty in front of her new partner. As we walked away hand in hand, leaving Clara speechless, I realized I was deeply, completely in love with the brave woman standing beside me. Sitting in the car afterward, we quietly admitted that we had broken our own rules and that our marriage had become entirely real to both of us. But our newfound happiness was suddenly threatened when a local attorney summoned us to his office with urgent news. He revealed that Clara and Francisco were actually part of a fraudulent financial ring that targeted trusting partners for massive, unauthorized loans. They had never intended to marry us, using our trust to secure signatures before planning to disappear and leave us with the debt. The attorney explained that our impulsive, desperate decision to marry each other had legally shielded our assets, completely neutralizing the fraudulent contracts they had forged. Thanks to Beatrice's wild suggestion, we had accidentally saved ourselves from absolute financial ruin while providing the crucial evidence needed to prosecute them. 3 months later, the authorities brought formal charges against our exes, and Diana and I were officially cleared of any legal liability, finally free to build our future together. On the 1-year anniversary of our chaotic wedding day, Diana and I stood before our friends and family to renew our vows under the warm summer sun. This time, there was beautiful music, tears of genuine joy, and Beatrice watching proudly from the front row as our guest of honor. As I held my wife in my arms, I realized that my greatest heartbreak had simply been the hidden pathway to my greatest joy. We had stepped off a cliff as desperate strangers, only to find that we were exactly what the other needed to be whole.